The sun was a hammer, the silence a shroud. Out here in the parched maw of the wasteland, sound and shadow went to die. Clay Hawthorne felt the heat not on his skin, but in his bones. A dry, baking ache that had long since cooked the moisture from his grief, leaving only a brittle residue of memory. He rode a creature as broken as himself, a dun mare with a limp that matched the drag in his own soul. He called her dust, for that was all they were and all they were destined to become. 35 years he'd been on this earth, and the last 10 felt like 100 years of running, first from the war that had hollowed him out, and then from the ghost of the man he'd been before it. Now there was nothing left to run from, and nowhere to run to. There was only the horizon, a shimmering lie of relief, and the gnawing emptiness in his belly that had become his most constant companion. His tongue was a swollen, foreign thing in his mouth, his lips cracked into a roadmap of his suffering. In his saddlebag, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that was stiff with age and grit, was the reason he was still moving. The last piece of bread. It wasn't much, dense, hardtack, a soldier's ration he'd clung to for weeks. It was a miserable communion wafer for a faith he'd lost, a sacrament of survival. He'd planned to eat half this morning, save the rest for a tomorrow that felt increasingly hypothetical. But the dust was too thick, the thirst too great. Swallowing it would have been like trying to swallow sand. So he waited, hoarding it. It was more than food, it was a promise, a single, tangible argument against giving up and letting the buzzards have him. His life weighed on the scales of the desert, balanced against a stale piece of bread. Dust stumbled, her head drooping low, and Clay slid from the saddle without conscious thought. The impact sent a shudder through his exhausted frame. He ran a hand down the mare's lathered neck, whispering words that were too dry to carry sound. Loyalty, that's what this animal was, a fool's loyalty to a fool. He leaned against her warm flank, his own legs threatening to buckle, and scanned the featureless expanse. Rock, sand, and the cruel, indifferent blue of the sky. It was a canvas wiped clean of meaning. He was a man reduced to his most basic components: thirst, hunger, a fading heartbeat. And then he saw her. She was sitting by a cluster of sun-bleached rocks, so still she might have been one of them. A child. Native by the look of her doe-skin dress and the straight fall of her black hair. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her legs were tucked beneath her, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't looking at him, but past him, her dark eyes fixed on the shimmering distance. There was no fear in her posture, only a profound and unsettling stillness. A deep, primal alarm went off in Clay's mind, a soldier's instinct screaming trap. A child alone in this desolation was bait. He scanned the ridges, the low bluffs that corrugated the horizon. His hand went instinctively to the worn butt of the pistol tucked in his belt, the metal hot against his skin. He saw nothing. No movement, no glint of a rifle barrel, only the heat devils dancing on the baked earth. He watched her for a long time, the sun crawling across the sky with agonizing slowness. She didn't move, not a twitch. Was she real? A mirage born of his dehydration and despair? He took a tentative step, then another. The crunch of his boots on the gravel was a profane intrusion into the silence. She still didn't look at him. As he drew closer, he saw the details that the distance had hidden. The fine film of dust on her dark skin, the way her small chest rose and fell in a rhythm so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Her lips were cracked like his own, but worse, tinged with blue at the edges. She wasn't bait. She was dying. He stopped a few feet away, the shadow of his body falling over her. Her gaze, slowly, ponderously, lifted to meet his. Her eyes were deep and dark, ancient pools of quiet suffering. They held no plea, no fear, only a kind of weary acceptance. In that moment, the wasteland inside him, the vast empty space where his humanity had once lived, felt a tremor. It was the faintest flicker of something he thought long dead. He saw not a native, not a potential threat, but a child at the end of her rope, just like him. The gnawing in his own gut was a physical pain. The bread was his survival. It was the wall between him and the void. To give it away was to surrender, to admit defeat, to choose death. His mind, the cold, calculating part that had kept him alive for so long, screamed at him. "Walk away. She is not your problem. You will die without it." But her eyes held him. They didn't ask for anything, and in their asking for nothing, they asked for everything. He was a hollowed-out man, a drifter whose only purpose was to see the next sunrise. What was that purpose worth? What was his life, this shadow play of existence, worth, weighed against the solid, undeniable reality of the child in front of him? He slowly, stiffly knelt. His joints protested with a series of cracks and groans. He pulled the saddlebag closer and unwrapped the oilcloth. The bread sat in his palm, heavy and real. It felt like the weight of the world. He looked at it, then back at the child. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible widening of her eyes. It wasn't hope. It was just attention, a flicker of life in the embers. The war had taught him to kill. The years since had taught him to survive. Nothing had taught him what to do now. He broke the bread in half. The sound was like a bone snapping. His hands trembled. He held out one half to her. It was a compromise, a fool's bargain with his own conscience. Half for her, half for him. Survival, shared. She didn't take it. She just looked at the bread, then back at his face. Her gaze was unnervingly perceptive. It stripped him bare, saw past the desperate compromise to the core of his selfishness. And in that silent judgment, Clay felt a shame so profound it burned hotter than the sun. He was calculating his life against a child's. He was haggling with death over its most vulnerable victim. The soldier in him died right there in the dust, under the gaze of an 8-year-old girl. What was left was just a man. A broken, failing man, but a man nonetheless. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his wasted years, he pushed the other half of the bread into her small, unresisting hands, joining it with the first, the whole loaf, his entire future. She looked down at the bread in her lap, then back up at him. Her expression didn't change, but he felt a shift in the air between them, a loosening of some cosmic knot. He pushed himself to his feet, his body feeling impossibly light, as if shedding the bread had shed a great physical weight. He turned to walk back to his horse, the act complete, the choice made. He had chosen her survival over his. There was a strange peace in it, the quiet of a settled account. "Ayana." Her voice was a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across stone. He stopped, turned back. She had broken off a tiny piece of the bread and was chewing it slowly, methodically, her body conserving every ounce of energy. "My people," she said, her voice a little stronger now, a little more present. She lifted a small hand and pointed toward the cliffs, the very same ones he had scanned for enemies. "They watch." A cold dread, stark and immediate, washed over Clay, chilling the sweat on his skin. He looked up at the sun-blasted ridges. He still saw nothing, but he felt it now. He felt the eyes, unseen, silent, judging. His act of kindness hadn't been a private transaction between two souls in the desert. It had been a performance, and he had no idea if the audience had approved. The raw survivalism of his hunger was gone, replaced by a fearful uncertainty that was infinitely more terrifying. He was no longer a lone drifter. He was the guardian of a child, and her life, and now his, was bound to the judgment of the ghosts on the cliffs. The emptiness in his gut was no longer just hunger. It was the hollow feeling of a man who had just traded his life for a debt he didn't understand. The silence that returned was different now, heavier. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of unseen listeners. Clay gave Ayana his canteen, and she drank sparingly, with a discipline that belied her years. He watched her, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He had made his choice, and the consequences were beginning to unfurl like a storm gathering on the horizon. He was responsible for her now. The thought was both a terror and an anchor. For the first time in years, he wasn't just drifting. He had a direction, a purpose, even if it was likely to get him killed. He helped her to her feet. She was weak, but she stood. She looked up at him, then took his hand. Her fingers were small and cool against his calloused, sunburnt skin. The contact was an electric shock to his system, a jolt of connection that traveled up his arm and settled somewhere deep inside his hollowed-out chest. He led her to dust, lifting her easily into the saddle. The mare shifted, but didn't protest, as if she understood. "Which way?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ayanna pointed not toward any visible landmark, but into a maze of rust-colored canyons that seemed to swallow the light. It was a direction he would have avoided, a place where an ambush would be simple and deadly, but he had no other path to follow. He took Dust's reins and began to walk, leading the horse and its precious cargo into the unknown, the weight of 100 unseen eyes pressing down on him from the cliffs above. And then he heard it. It started as a vibration in the soles of his boots, a low thrum that was more felt than heard. It grew steadily, a deep percussive rhythm that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, hoofbeats, many of them. Not the panicked, scattered sound of wild animals, but the steady, disciplined cadence of riders. They were distant, but they were coming. The sound was relentless, a drumming heartbeat that marked the passing seconds of his borrowed time. Ayanna heard it too. She sat straighter in the saddle, her small hand gripping the pommel, but her face remained a mask of calm. Her quiet resilience was both a comfort and a source of profound dread. She knew these sounds. She knew who was coming. Clay's mind raced. He could try to run, push Dust to her limit, but the mare was lame and he was on foot. They wouldn't get far. He could find a place to hide, a crevice in the rocks, but whoever was tracking them had been watching for hours. They would know the terrain far better than he did. His hand strayed again to his pistol. One gun against... how many? A dozen? 50? It was suicide. His choices had narrowed to one, to walk forward and meet them. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, a rolling thunder that echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from all directions at once. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening band around his chest that made it hard to breathe. He kept walking, one foot in front of the other, his gaze fixed on the canyon path ahead. He was no longer just a man leading a horse. He was an offering, walking toward an altar of judgment. He could feel the eyes now not just from the cliffs above, but from the shadows ahead, from the rocks on either side. They were everywhere. They appeared without a sound, materializing from the landscape as if they were born of the rock and dust itself. One moment, the path was empty. The next, it was blocked. Warriors. At least 20 of them, mounted on powerful piebald ponies that snorted and stamped in the heat. They were lean, hard men, their faces grim, their bodies adorned with the stark geometry of war paint. They held lances tipped with flint and obsidian, and bows that looked strong enough to punch an arrow through a buffalo. They formed a silent, impassable wall, their dark eyes fixed on him, missing nothing. Clay stopped. He put a hand on Dust's neck to steady her, and himself. This was it, the end of the line, the culmination of a choice made over a piece of bread. He had expected war cries, whoops, aggression. Instead, there was only that same profound, unnerving silence. It was more menacing than any threat. It was the silence of absolute authority. One warrior dismounted and walked toward him. He was older than the others, his face a roadmap of scars, his eyes holding a deep, ancient skepticism. One eye was clouded, milky white, but the other was sharp and clear, and it seemed to see right through Clay, weighing the marrow in his bones. This was a chief, a man of power. This must be Red Bear, the name whispered in frontier forts, a name synonymous with brutal resistance. Red Bear stopped a few paces away. He didn't look at Clay. His gaze was fixed on Ayanna. He said something in his own tongue, a question that was soft but carried the unyielding strength of rock. Ayanna replied in the same language, her voice small but clear. It was a short exchange, no more than a few words, but it seemed to hold the weight of a verdict. Red Bear's good eye finally shifted to Clay. It was full of a cold fire, a distrust so deep it was geological, formed over generations of betrayal and bloodshed. He saw not a man who had helped a child, but a white man, an enemy, an intruder. To him, Clay's act could only be a trick, a strange and unpredictable tactic in an old, old war. He barked an order, and two warriors moved forward, their intentions clear. Clay's hand tightened on his pistol. It was a fool's move, and he knew it, but the instinct for a last stand was bred into him. Before he could draw, Ayanna spoke again, her voice sharp this time, insistent. It was a single word, but it stopped the two warriors in their tracks. They looked from her to Red Bear, their faces unreadable. Red Bear stared at Ayanna, a flicker of something, surprise, frustration, crossing his scarred face. He grunted, a sound of reluctant concession, and gestured with his chin. Clay was to follow. They didn't bind him. They didn't disarm him. They simply surrounded him, a silent, moving cage of horseflesh and warrior flesh, and led him deeper into the labyrinthine canyons. The hoofbeats were no longer a distant threat, but an immediate, suffocating presence. He was a prisoner, but a strange kind of prisoner, one whose fate seemed to hang on the word of a quiet 8-year-old girl. The journey lasted for what felt like hours. The canyon walls grew higher, the path narrower, twisting and turning until Clay was completely disoriented. The air grew cooler, and he could smell water and wood smoke. They rounded a final bend, and the canyon opened into a hidden valley, a slash of impossible green in the heart of the red desert. A clear stream snaked through a meadow dotted with lodges made of hide and timber. The smoke he had smelled came from a dozen small fires, where women tended to cooking pots and children played, their laughter a sound so normal it was shocking. This was their home, a sanctuary hidden from the world, a place of life carved out of a world of death. He was led to the center of the village before the largest lodge. The warriors dismounted, forming a loose circle, their faces still grim, their watchfulness unabated. The flap of the lodge was pushed aside, and a man emerged. He was old, his hair a river of silver that fell past his shoulders, his face a magnificent ruin of deep lines and weathered dignity. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his presence radiating a quiet power that dwarfed Red Bear's aggressive authority. He wore no paint, carried no weapon but a simple walking stick, yet every eye was on him. His gaze was the most formidable Clay had ever faced, sharp, intelligent, and filled with a sorrow so vast it seemed to contain the history of his people. Ayanna slid from Dust's back and ran to the old man, not with the panicked relief of a rescued child, but with the simple, confident affection of a granddaughter. She threw her arms around his legs and buried her face in his leggings. The old man placed a hand on her head, his gnarled fingers stroking her hair. The revelation struck Clay with the force of a physical blow. This was Takakota, the war chief of the 7 tribes, and Ayanna, the silent child in the desert, was his granddaughter. Takakota's eyes lifted from Ayanna and settled on Clay. He looked at Clay's worn boots, his tattered clothes, his holstered pistol, and finally, his face. He saw the exhaustion, the fear, the confusion. His gaze lingered, and Clay had the distinct impression that the old chief was seeing more than just the surface, that he was reading the story of the last 10 years etched on Clay's soul. Takakota spoke, his voice deep and resonant, like stones rolling in a riverbed. He did not speak to Clay, but to his people. Red Bear stepped forward and spoke quickly, his words sharp and angry. He gestured at Clay, his meaning clear even without understanding the language. This is an enemy, a scout, a trick. When Red Bear finished, the silence returned, thick with anticipation. Takakota let the silence stretch, his gaze never leaving Clay. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, cutting through the tension. He beckoned Clay forward. Hesitantly, Clay took a few steps, stopping before the chief. He expected to be questioned, accused, condemned. He stood tall, preparing himself for the end. Death was an old acquaintance. Takakota reached out and, with a gesture of profound, unexpected gentleness, took the empty canteen from Clay's belt. He passed it to a woman, who hurried away and returned moments later with it full of cool, clear water. Takakota handed it back to Clay, then he pointed to a fire where a piece of meat was roasting on a spit. He nodded toward it. It was not a judgment. It was an invitation. Red Bear let out a guttural sound of protest, but Takakota silenced him with a glance. The old chief turned his gaze back to Clay, and for the first time, he spoke in the white man's tongue, his words accented but clear. "My granddaughter tells me you gave her your last bread," he said. The statement was simple, but it resonated with the weight of a formal decree. "In the custom of my people, a life saved creates a debt. Her life is precious to us. Therefore the debt is great. You are not a prisoner here. You are a guest until this debt can be understood." Clay stared at him, dumbfounded. He had given away his survival in an act of what he thought was finality, a quiet surrender. Instead, he had purchased his life and stumbled into a world of obligations he couldn't possibly comprehend. He was caught, not by force of arms, but by a single act of compassion. As he was led to a fire and given food and water, he felt the eyes of the entire village on him. He saw curiosity, suspicion, and in the scarred face of Red Bear, pure, undiluted hatred. He was forced to confront his own prejudices, the caricature of the savage he'd been fed his whole life, as he witnessed the complex, undeniable humanity of a people he had been taught to fear and despise. The wasteland he had escaped was simple. This place, this web of honor, debt, and judgment, was infinitely more dangerous. The days that followed were a slow, disorienting immersion into another reality. Clay lived in a small lodge set apart from the others, a guest in a gilded cage. He was watched constantly, not with overt hostility, but with a quiet, persistent observation that frayed his nerves. He saw Red Bear often, a brooding presence at the edge of his vision, a constant reminder of the precariousness of his situation. But it was Takakota who commanded his attention. The old chief would summon him to his lodge in the cool of the evenings. They would sit by the fire, the air thick with the scent of sage and cedar, and they would talk. At first, Clay was guarded, his answers clipped, a soldier's habit of revealing nothing. But Takakota's questions were not about military strength or troop movements. He asked about the crops Clay's father had grown, the name of his mother, the feel of rain in the land he came from. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his ancient eyes seeming to absorb every word, every hesitation, every lie. In turn, Clay learned. He learned that Ayana's mother, Takakota's only daughter, had been killed in a cavalry raid 5 years prior. He learned that the 7 tribes had been pushed from their ancestral lands, squeezed into this last, hidden sanctuary by the relentless pressure of settlers and soldiers. He heard the stories behind the scars on Red Bear's face, not from battle with other tribes, but from a government treaty meeting that had ended in a massacre. "He does not hate you, Clay Hawthorne," Takakota said one evening, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "He hates the memory that you wear on your skin. He sees your face and sees the men who burned his village, who killed his wife. To trust you would be to betray them." "I'm not them," Clay said, the words feeling thin and useless. "An action is a stone dropped in a pond," Takakota replied. "The ripples spread. You dropped a stone of kindness. Red Bear has only ever seen stones of violence. He waits for the ripple to drown him." Clay began to see the village not as a collection of warriors, but as a community of survivors. He saw craftsmen tooling leather with intricate skill, women singing as they ground corn, old men telling stories to wide-eyed children. He saw Ayana, now healthy and vibrant, moving through the village with a quiet grace. She would sometimes bring him a bowl of stew or a piece of fruit, a silent continuation of the exchange they had started in the desert. In her eyes, he saw not debt, but a simple, uncomplicated acceptance. For her, He was not a white man, not a soldier, not a symbol. He was the man who had given her bread. His own past, the one he had tried to outrun, felt closer here than it ever had in the empty spaces. The violence he had participated in, the orders he had followed without question, it all took on a new, sharper reality. He was part of the storm that had driven these people into this canyon. His uniform had been a different color than Captain Morrison's, but they had served the same unforgiving machine. One afternoon, a rider galloped into the valley, his horse lathered in sweat. He was an elder named Moon Dancer, a messenger from the southern tribes. He went straight to Takakota's lodge, and soon the low, urgent hum of discussion spread through the village. Later, Takakota sent for Clay. "The chiefs of the 7 tribes will gather," the old man announced. He stood tall, his presence filling the lodge. "They come to the Canyon of the Echoing Spirit in 2 days. They come to debate your presence here. They come to debate your action." Clay felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. "What is there to debate?" "Everything," Takakota said. "To some, your kindness to my granddaughter is a sign, a possibility that a new path can be walked between our peoples. They see it as a seed of peace. To others, like Red Bear, it is the most dangerous kind of lie, a trick to make us lower our guard before the final slaughter. They see it as a seed of destruction." Takakota's gaze was heavy. "You are no longer a man, Clay Hawthorne. You have become a symbol, and they are coming to decide what you symbolize." The gathering was a sight that burned itself into Clay's memory. In a vast, high-walled canyon, a natural amphitheater carved by wind and water, the 7 tribes convened. Over 500 warriors, the collective strength of their nations, assembled in silent ranks along the canyon floor and upon the hidden ledges of the cliffs. The air was electric with tension, a fragile peace held together by the gravity of Takakota's authority. Clay stood beside Takakota on a raised platform, the object of every stare. He felt naked, exposed, a single white pine in a forest of aspen. The chiefs sat in a semicircle before them. Red Bear, his face a thundercloud of resentment, a stoic chief from the river tribes, his arms corded with muscle, a wizened ancient shaman whose eyes seemed to look into another world. The debate began. It was a storm of words, of passionate argument and bitter history. Red Bear spoke first, his voice a rasp of old wounds. He recounted the broken treaties, the stolen lands, the massacres. He pointed a trembling finger at Clay. "His skin is the color of the lies they tell. His kindness is a poison sweetened with honey. You see one man, Takakota, but I see the army that follows him. To trust him is to dig our own graves." Other chiefs echoed his sentiment, their voices full of the grief and rage of a people pushed to the edge of extinction. But then others spoke, their tones more measured. A young chief argued that their old ways of fighting had only led to more loss. Perhaps a new way was needed. An elder spoke of a prophecy, of a stranger who would come not with a sword, but with bread, bridging the chasm between 2 worlds. Through it all, Clay stood silent, a living effigy at the heart of the fire. He was not on trial for what he had done, but for what he was. He was the embodiment of their deepest fear and their most desperate hope. He listened to them recount the sins of his people, and he could not deny a word of it. The guilt was a physical weight on his shoulders. Finally, Takakota rose to speak. A hush fell over the canyon. "I have heard your words," he began, his voice ringing with clarity. "Your fear is wise. Your anger is just. The white man has given us a history written in our own blood, but history is what is behind us. The path forward is the one we choose to walk today." He turned and looked at Clay. "I do not look at this man's skin. I look at his actions. In the desert he had one choice, his life or the life of a child of our people. He chose the child. He did not know she was my blood. He did not know he was being watched. He acted from a place that has no color, no tribe. He acted from the heart." He gestured to the silent warriors. "We have fought. We have died. Our walls of anger and hatred have not kept us safe. They have only penned us in. Perhaps courage is not only found in fighting our enemies, but in having the strength to build trust where there is only division. A murmur went through the crowd. He was swaying them. A fragile hope began to dawn in the canyon, and that was when Clay saw it. High on the rim of the canyon, stark against the brilliant blue sky, figures appeared. Riders, not natives, soldiers. Their forms were unmistakable, the straight-backed posture, the glint of sun on rifle barrels. He counted a dozen, then two, then more. And leading them, sitting on a powerful black stallion, was a man whose profile Clay knew as well as his own. Captain Morrison. A cold, sickening dread coiled in Clay's stomach. Morrison, his former commanding officer, a man who saw the world in black and white, friend and foe, order and savagery, a man who believed the only good native was a dead one. Morrison must have been tracking him, or perhaps he was simply on a brutal patrol. It didn't matter. His presence here now was a lit fuse on a powder keg. A warrior near the platform let out a sharp cry, pointing to the canyon rim. A wave of alarm rippled through the assembly. Voices rose in anger and fear. Red Bear shot Takakota a look of furious triumph. I told you he was a scout, a traitor. The fragile peace shattered. Warriors reached for their weapons. The debate was over. The verdict was in. Blood. In that moment of escalating chaos, something inside Clay went perfectly still and clear. He was the symbol. He was the catalyst. He could not let this happen. He could not let his presence here be the cause of the very massacre Red Bear had predicted. He had been running his whole life. Now, there was nowhere to run. There was only one path. Before Takakota or anyone else could react, Clay stepped off the platform and began to walk. He walked away from the chiefs, away from the warriors, into the open space in the center of the canyon floor. He walked toward the canyon entrance, toward the path that would lead up to the rim, toward Morrison. He was unarmed, his pistol left behind in the lodge. He had only himself. A stunned silence fell over the canyon. Every eye, native and soldier, was on him. He was a lone figure walking into a no-man's land between two worlds, poised to annihilate each other. He could feel Takakota's stare on his back, a question mark burning into his soul. He kept walking, his stride steady, his purpose absolute. He was a bridge, and a bridge has to be willing to be walked on from both sides. He reached the base of the winding path and began to climb. He could see Morrison more clearly now, his face set in a hard, cruel line. He saw the contempt in Morrison's eyes as he watched Clay approach. The climb was long, arduous. With every step, Clay felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes below and dozens more above. He was the single moving part in a tableau of imminent violence. Finally, he reached the rim, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood 20 feet from Morrison and his riders. The wind whipped at his clothes. Hawthorne, Morrison spat his name like a curse. I should have known I'd find you in a snake pit. What is this? Have you gone native? They're talking, Morrison, Clay said, his voice level, calm. A peace council. Morrison laughed, a short, ugly bark. Peace? With them? There's no peace with vermin. We just thin the herd now and then. Looks like we found the main nest. He gestured with his rifle at the canyon below. An army of them. Good intelligence, Hawthorne. Unintentional, I'm sure. You don't have to do this, Clay said, taking a step closer. They're chiefs, elders. There are women and children in their village. They're all the same, Morrison sneered, his knuckles white on his rifle stock. This is a gift, Hawthorne, a chance to wipe the slate clean. We can end 100 years of trouble right here, right now. His eyes gleamed with a fanatic's light. Clay saw the abyss of Morrison's hatred, and he knew that logic wouldn't work. Reason wouldn't work. There was only one thing left. Truth. You know, for years I believed what you believe, Clay said, his voice carrying in the tense silence. I followed the orders. I burned the villages. I called it duty. I told myself it was us or them. He looked Morrison directly in the eye. But I was wrong. I was just afraid that if I saw them as people, I'd have to see myself as a monster. Morrison's face tightened. Shut your mouth, traitor. Down there, Clay pointed into the canyon, is a man named Takakota. His daughter was killed by men like us. There's another Red Bear who watched his family die at a treaty signing he thought was safe. They have every reason to hate us, every reason to want us dead. Clay took another step. He was a dozen feet away now. But they were willing to talk, not about war, but about a piece of bread given to a hungry child. They were willing to see one man, one action, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, the future didn't have to look like the past. Clay's voice grew stronger, ringing with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. You see an army of savages. I see 500 men who chose to talk instead of fight. You see a nest to be cleansed. I see a chance, the only one we might ever get. He spread his hands, empty, open. The only thing standing between peace and a massacre right now is you, Captain. Your fear, your hatred. Is that the legacy you want? More blood on your hands, just to prove you're strong? Morrison's face was a mask of contorted rage. Clay had verbally disarmed him, turned his own rhetoric of strength into a question of weakness. He had held up a mirror, and Morrison could not stand the reflection. Damn you to hell, Hawthorne! Morrison roared, raising his rifle. Fire! He screamed to his men. Wipe them out! The riders raised their rifles. The moment hung, stretched thin, about to snap. And then Takakota acted. From his position on the platform below, he lifted his hand. It was not a signal for attack. It was a signal to rise. From the cliffs, from the shadows, from behind every rock and crevice, the warriors stood up. Not just the 500 in the canyon floor, but hundreds more hidden on the upper ledges, unseen until this very moment. An entire nation revealed. They rose in absolute silence, a forest of armed men materializing from the earth. They did not whoop or cry out, they simply stood. A solid, silent wall of overwhelming force, their arrows notched, their lances poised. They held the high ground, they held the numbers. Morrison and his men were surrounded, hopelessly, utterly outmaneuvered. The air went out of Morrison's rage. His command to fire died in his throat. His riders lowered their rifles, their faces pale with shock. They had thought they were the hunters, perched on the edge of the pit. They were, in fact, the ones in the trap. Takakota had turned the tables completely. He had shown the full, devastating extent of his power and had chosen not to use it. It was not a declaration of war. It was a demonstration of the power of peace, backed by the strength to enforce it. Clay stood between the two forces, the living fulcrum of the standoff. He had not won with a gun. He had won with trust. He had gambled his life on the character of a man he barely knew, and that man had not let him down. Morrison stared, his jaw slack, his authority stripped bare. He looked at the silent, watching warriors. He looked at Clay, standing alone, having defeated him without throwing a single punch. Humiliation and fear warred on his face. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his rifle. With a choked curse, he wrenched his horse around and spurred away from the canyon rim, his men scrambling to follow, a frantic, disorganized retreat. They disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the wasteland they sought to conquer. In the canyon below, a sound began. It was not a cheer of victory. It was a low, deep murmur of respect, a sound that rose from 500 throats and echoed off the ancient stone walls. It was for Takakota's wisdom. It was for the peace that had been won. And it was for the lone man on the canyon rim who had been willing to walk into the fire. Clay slowly walked back from the edge, his legs shaking with adrenaline and relief. He looked down at the sea of faces. He saw Red Bear, his expression not of hatred anymore, but of stunned, grudging disbelief. He saw Takakota, whose gaze met his across the distance, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. A debt had been created in the desert. Now, a debt had been paid. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the canyon in hues of gold and rose, Clay Hawthorne felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He no longer had the desire to drift. He was no longer running from his past. He was standing on a bridge he had helped to build, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was home. The seasons turned, and the story of the man who walked out of the desert with the chief's granddaughter, the man who faced down the cavalry with empty hands, became a legend woven into the fabric of the 7 tribes. Clay Hawthorne did not leave. The urge to drift, the gnawing restlessness that had defined his life, had been scoured out of him in that single, clarifying confrontation. He had found a purpose not in a place, but in the space between 2 worlds. He accepted the role Takakota offered him, not a warrior, not a chief, but a builder, a teacher, a bridge. He taught the young how to read the white man's words, not so they would forget their own, but so they would never again be tricked by a treaty they could not understand. He taught them basic farming techniques he remembered from his distant childhood, helping them coax new life from the valley's soil. In turn, he learned their language, their stories, the intricate rhythms of their life, until the cadence of their words felt as natural as his own. He never held a weapon again. His strength was in his patience, his currency was trust, earned one splinter and scar at a time. Red Bear watched him for a year, his skepticism a hard shield. But one day, he saw Clay sitting with a group of children, patiently explaining the meaning of a word in a worn book, and saw Ayana sitting beside him, translating for the youngest ones. Red Bear turned and walked away, and his shadow of distrust no longer fell upon Clay. Years folded into a decade. A town grew, not in the hidden valley, but at the confluence of 2 creeks, where the wasteland began to soften into prairie. It was not a fort, nor was it a village. It was something new. 2 creeks. The houses were built of timber and adobe, a blend of 2 styles, sturdy and honest. The children who played in the single dusty street had eyes of blue and brown, hair of black and gold. They were fluent in 2 languages, comfortable in 2 worlds, their very existence a testament to the peace that had been so precariously won. Ayana grew into a woman of quiet strength and profound wisdom, her leadership a reflection of her grandfather's vision and Clay's steadfast heart. She moved between the 2 cultures with an easy grace, the living embodiment of the bridge he had sought to build. Sometimes, in the quiet of a long evening, an older Clay would walk to the low hills overlooking the town. He would stand there, his hair now streaked with gray, his face weathered not by despair but by sun and time, and he would watch the lights flicker on in the small houses below. He would see families gathering for their evening meal, their laughter carrying on the cool desert air. He would remember the oppressive heat, the gnawing hunger, the desperate loneliness of a man whose life was worth no more than a piece of bread, and he would feel a sense of wonder so deep it was almost painful. How a single selfless act, a choice made in an instant of forgotten grace, could ripple outward, echoing across generations, changing the course of a history that had seemed written in stone. He had started as a man running from his past and had become a man who had built a future. A hard-earned peace, born not of victory in battle, but of the simple, enduring truth that had been offered and accepted long ago in the form of a shared piece of bread.